The warning signal tore through space like a scream that would never end. Deep inside Council Station Alpha, the massive communication arrays picked up another desperate message from the far edges of known space. Another Zellery world had stopped, talking forever. Ambassador Kethlin stood before the giant holographic map that showed the entire galaxy. His reptilian skin was covered in small, shimmering scales that changed color when he felt strong emotions. Right now, those scales were turning dark blue, the color of fear and sadness among his people. Across the map of Zellery territory, bright red dots kept appearing. Each red dot meant another world where millions of innocent beings had died. His young assistant walked up beside him, her own scales pale with worry. She had been working for the Council for only 3 years, but she had never seen anything this terrible. The Zellery were known throughout the galaxy as the kindest, most peaceful people anyone had ever met. They spent their time creating beautiful art, growing amazing plants that floated in the air, and trading fairly with everyone they met. "Sir, how many of their worlds have we lost contact with now?" she asked, though she was afraid to hear the answer. Kethlin's hands shook as he counted the red markers again. 17 colonies are gone, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The Carvex Empire doesn't care about mercy or peace. They just want to destroy everything beautiful. In the galaxy, the Carvex were everything the Zellery were not. Where the Zellery built cities made of living crystal that sang in the wind, the Carvex built massive war machines that turned planets into ash. Where the Zellery created floating gardens that fed entire populations, the Carvex strip-mined worlds, until nothing could ever grow again. The Carvex believed that might made right. They had been proving it by conquering peaceful species for hundreds of years. The Galactic HFY Stab Council had tried to stop them before. They sent their best peacekeeping forces, trained soldiers from a dozen different worlds, equipped with the most advanced weapons and shields available. The first battle lasted 6 hours before the peacekeepers had to run away to save their lives. The second battle was even worse. Half the peacekeeping fleet never made it home. "Sir," his assistant said quietly, looking around to make sure no one else could hear, "there is one option we haven't talked about yet. What about the new species we discovered in Sector 7G? The ones from that impossible planet?" Kethlin's large, dark eyes grew wide with surprise. "You mean the Terrans? The humans?" He shook his head quickly. "They only learned how to travel between stars a few decades ago. Their ships are slow, and their weapons are simple. What could they possibly do against the Carvex Empire?" His assistant pulled up a file on her portable computer. The information inside made both of them uncomfortable to read. "But sir, look at their home planet. Scientists say that nothing should have been able to survive there, let alone become intelligent. Earth has deadly storms that can destroy entire cities, diseases that kill millions, and natural disasters that happen all the time. The gravity is so strong that most species would be crushed just standing on the surface." She continued reading from the report. "They have massive predators with teeth longer than my arm. Their oceans are full of creatures that can swallow ship whole. Even their plants can kill you if you touch them wrong. And somehow, these humans not only survived all of that, they became the dominant species on their planet." Kethlin thought about this for a long moment. The humans had only recently joined the galactic community, and most species treated them like curious but harmless primitives. Their technology was decades behind everyone else's.
Alden.
Their ships looked crude and ugly compared to the elegant designs of advanced civilizations. But there was something in the reports about them that made other species uncomfortable. Humans seemed to enjoy things that would terrify normal people. They played games that simulated warfare. They told stories about monsters and danger for entertainment. They actually chose to do dangerous things just for fun. Suddenly another alarm started ringing throughout the station. A new message was coming in from Zellery space. Kethlin activated the communication system, and the voice of a Zellery leader filled the room. The being sounded terrified and exhausted. "This is Elder Zeltar, from the colony world Brightstar. The Carvex ships are in orbit above us. They're demanding we surrender all our resources and become their slaves. If we refuse, they'll burn our world like they burned the others. Please, anyone who can hear this, we need help. Our children are crying. Our elders are preparing to die. We don't know how to fight. We don't even have weapons. Someone please help us before it's too late." The message ended with the sound of explosions in the background. Another peaceful world was about to become a graveyard. Kethlin looked at his assistant, then back at the holographic map where another red dot was starting to blink. The most peaceful species in the galaxy was being wiped out by the most violent, and the Council's traditional methods had failed completely. "Send a message to Earth," he said finally. "Tell them we need to talk." Admiral Lehan walked slowly around the large metal table in the center of the war room. The table projected a three-dimensional map of space that showed every star system, every planet, and every ship for hundreds of light years around. But right now, all his attention was focused on one small section of the galaxy where something terrible was happening. The battleship Incheon was humanity's newest and most powerful warship. It stretched over 1 kilometer long and carried enough firepower to crack a moon in half. But even with all that strength, Li Hian felt sick to his stomach as he read the reports coming in from Zelari space. What the Karvex were doing wasn't war, it was murder on a scale that made him angry in ways he had never felt before. Around the table, his most trusted officers studied the same information. These were men and women who had spent their entire careers preparing for the day when humanity might have to fight other species among the stars. They had trained for space battles, alien invasion scenarios, and diplomatic crises. But none of them had ever imagined they would be reading reports about an entire peaceful civilization being wiped out, just because they couldn't fight back. Colonel Kim Tae-ho was humanity's expert on alien military tactics. He had spent years studying how different species fought wars, and he knew more about galactic warfare than almost any human alive. He pointed to the holographic display showing recent Karvex attacks. "Sir, they followed the same pattern every single time," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "First, they park their big ships above a planet and start bombing everything that looks important. Cities, power plants, communication centers, anything that helps the planet work together. Then, when the people below are too scared and broken to organize any resistance, they send down ground troops to take whatever they want." Kim Tae-ho pulled up images of destroyed Zelari cities. Beautiful crystal structures that had taken centuries to grow were now nothing but glowing rubble. "It's not even really military strategy, sir. It's more like hunting helpless animals. They pick targets they know can't fight back, then they take their time destroying everything beautiful about their civilization." Captain Park Min-ji ran the intelligence division on the ship. She was responsible for understanding enemy psychology and predicting what they might do next. She had been studying Karvex behavior patterns for weeks now, and what she found made her both disgusted and confident at the same time. "Admiral, I've analyzed their command structure and decision-making patterns," she said, bringing up charts showing Karvex battle formations. "They're extremely aggressive, but they're also predictable. They've been winning fights for so long that they've never learned to adapt when things go wrong. Every battle they've ever fought has been against species that were either too peaceful to fight back or too weak to hurt them seriously." She highlighted several tactical reports from previous Karvex campaigns. "Look at this pattern, sir. Whenever they face any real resistance, even small amounts, their commanders panic and make terrible decisions. They're used to their enemies running away or surrendering immediately. They have no experience dealing with an enemy that fights back effectively." Park Min-ji's analysis continued as she showed images of the Karvex homeworld and their other major planets. "The psychological profiles we've built show that they evolved on worlds that were essentially paradise. Perfect weather, no dangerous animals, unlimited resources. The biggest threat they ever faced was competition from their own species for who got the best territory. They have no concept of surviving against a hostile environment or an enemy that refuses to give up." Admiral Li Huyan listened to all of this and felt a cold smile spread across his face. He had been born and raised on Earth, the planet that the galactic community had officially classified as a death world. a place where life was so dangerous and difficult that most species would die within hours of landing there. Humans had evolved while competing with saber-toothed cats, surviving ice ages that lasted thousands of years, enduring plagues that killed half their population, and living through asteroid impacts that blocked out the sun for years at a time. A single day on Earth was a battle for survival that never ended. Humans had learned to fight against enemies they couldn't see, like diseases and radiation. They had learned to work together when facing natural disasters that could wipe out entire civilizations. They had learned to keep fighting even when everything seemed hopeless, because on Earth, giving up meant extinction. Navigation. How long would it take us to reach the Zalari systems if we pushed our engines to maximum speed? Li Hyan asked. Lieutenant Commander Choi Jung-min quickly calculated the distance and fuel requirements. Sir, if we burn our drives at full power and don't worry about fuel efficiency, we could be there in 2 weeks. But that would mean arriving with nearly empty fuel tanks and no reserves for extended combat. Li Hun shook his head. 2 weeks is too long. Those people are dying right now, while we sit here talking. He turned to address his entire staff. The Karvex think they're hunting helpless prey. They've no idea they've just made an enemy. Of the only species in the galaxy that learned to fight by surviving on a planet that tried to kill them every single day, he activated the ship's communication system to contact the rest of the human fleet. All ships, this is Admiral Li Hang. Prepare for immediate departure. Combat readiness, level 1. We're going to show the Karvex why Earth is called a death world, and why that makes us very, very dangerous. Within hours, 20 human warships were racing through space toward a war unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. The Karvex war fleet floated above Solari Prime like a pack of metal vultures circling their prey. 15 massive dreadnought ships, each one the size of a small city, hung motionless in the planet's orbit. All below them, most beautiful world in this part of the galaxy, was slowly dying under a rain of plasma fire and explosive missiles. Admiral Dexter stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Bone Crusher, watching the destruction with the satisfied smile of a predator that had cornered helpless prey. Through the massive viewing windows, you could see the elegant crystal spires of the Zelari capital city, cracking and falling like broken glass. Each explosion sent waves of colorful light through the crystal structures before they collapsed into glittering dust. The Karvex admiral was huge even by his species standards, standing nearly 3 meters tall with thick armored skin that looked like it was made from black metal. His people had evolved to be perfect warriors, strong, aggressive, and completely without mercy for anything they considered weak. For over 200 years, Karvex Empire had been expanding across the galaxy by conquering peaceful species and taking everything they owned. Sir, the residential districts are completely destroyed, reported his weapons officer, with obvious pleasure. The Zelari government is trying to broadcast a surrender message, but we're jamming all their communications like you ordered, Dex-4 nodded approvingly. He didn't want surrenders. He wanted the complete destruction of Zelari civilization. Their beautiful cities and advanced technology would be stripped away and added to the Karvex Empire. The surviving Zelari would become slaves, working in mines and factories until they died from exhaustion. Excellent work, he said, watching another section of the Crystal City collapse. Continue the bombardment for another 6 hours, then send down the ground forces to collect anything valuable. Make sure the survivors understand that resistance is impossible. Suddenly, the ship's alarm system started screaming. The bridge lighting changed from normal white to flashing red emergency colors. Dex-4 spun around to face his sensor operator, a thin Karvex technician who was staring at his instruments with confusion and growing fear.
Sir, we have unknown contacts approaching fast from hyperspace.
The technician reported, his voice shaking slightly. 20 ships, medium size, configuration unknown. They're not in any of our databases. Dex-4 felt a moment of curiosity but no real concern. In all his years of conquest, no one had ever dared to interfere with a Karvex military operation. The few times other species had tried to help their victims, the Karvex had simply destroyed the would-be rescuers and then made their original targets suffer even more for daring to ask for help. Reinforcements from the Galactic Council? He asked with a harsh laugh. Oh, I thought their pathetic peacekeepers had learned their lesson after we destroyed half their fleet last year. Apparently, they need another demonstration of Karvek's superiority. Da! 20 unknown ships dropped out of hyperspace in perfect formation, appearing suddenly in the space between the Karvek's fleet and the dying planet below. Thexfer studied them through his ship's powerful telescopes and frowned with confusion. These vessels were nothing like the elegant, curved designs favored by most galactic civilizations. Instead, they looked like they had been built for war and nothing else angular, aggressive, and covered with weapon systems that seemed to point in every direction at once. Those aren't council ships, his tactical officer observed with growing concern. I've never seen designs like that before. They look almost ... primitive, but heavily armed. Dexavar activated his ship's communication system and broadcast on all standard frequencies. His voice carried the arrogant tone of someone who had never lost a battle and expected to intimidate any enemy. Just by speaking to them, unidentified. Fleet, this is Admiral Vexver of the Karvex Empire. You are interfering with a legitimate military operation authorized by Imperial decree. Withdraw immediately, or you will be destroyed, along with the vermin we are exterminating. The response came back almost instantly, spoken in heavily accented galactic standard by someone who clearly wasn't intimidated by threats. The voice was calm, cold, and carried an undertone of barely controlled rage that made even Thexfer feel slightly uncomfortable. This is Admiral Li Huyan of the Terran Expeditionary Force. You have 30 seconds to cease fire on the planet below and withdraw all forces from Zalari space. This is your only warning. The X-First confusion turned to disbelief and then to explosive laughter that echoed throughout his bridge. His officers joined in, finding the situation hilariously absurd. The Terrans were the newest species to join galactic civilization, barely advanced enough to travel between stars. Using crude technology that was decades behind everyone else, they were from some impossible death world that most civilized species couldn't even survive visiting, and they had never fought a real space battle against anyone. Terrans. Dexfer gasped between fits of laughter. The primitive Deathworlders think they can threaten the mighty Karvex Empire. You pathetic animals don't even have proper weapons or shields. You dare threaten us. The human voice responded with chilling calmness. 29 seconds. The countdown continued with mechanical precision. 28 seconds. 27 seconds. Each number spoken in the same emotionless tone that somehow managed to sound more threatening than all of Thexfer's screaming and posturing. This is ridiculous, Thexfer declared. Weapons, target those primitive ships, and destroy them. Show these Deathworld savages what real military power looks like. 26 seconds, 25 seconds. But something was wrong. This weapons officer was frantically working at his controls, but the ship's main guns weren't responding. Properly, sir. We're having targeting problems. Their ships are moving in patterns that don't make sense. They're not following any recognized evasion protocols. 24 seconds. 23 seconds. The human ships weren't just moving randomly. They were positioning themselves in ways that looked suicidal, but somehow kept them out of the optimal firing solutions for the Karvex weapons. It was like watching someone dance through a minefield, while blindfolded, except they were avoiding every mine perfectly. 22 seconds. 21 seconds. Sure, should we launch fighters? Asked his flight commander. 20 seconds. 19 seconds. Dex-4 was no longer laughing. There was something about the way these humans spoke, the way they moved. Their ships, that reminded him of the predators from his homeworld's ancient history. Before his people had evolved into civilized warriors, they had been prey animals hiding from creatures that hunted with this same patient, methodical approach. 18 seconds. 17 seconds. Fire everything. Dexfer screamed. Kill them all. The countdown reached 0, and hell erupted in the vacuum of space. Sergeant O.J. soon pressed himself flat against the broken concrete wall, feeling the rough edges of twisted metal cutting into his combat armor. Around him, the ruins of New Zelian City stretched out like a graveyard made of shattered crystal and melted glass. What had once been the most beautiful city on this side of the galaxy now looked like something from humanity's worst nightmares. Zellerie had built their cities to be works of art that could house millions of people. Their buildings were grown rather than constructed, made from living crystal that sang soft melodies in the wind, and glowed with gentle colors that changed with the time of day. The streets had been filled with floating gardens where impossible. Flowers bloomed in midair, creating a paradise that visitors from across the galaxy had traveled for years just to see. Now it was all gone. The Carvex bombardment had turned the singing crystal into silent, jagged chunks scattered across cratered streets. The floating gardens had crashed to the ground, their beautiful flowers withered and black. Where once there had been the glow of living crystal, now there were only the harsh red lights of Carvex occupation forces and the dull smoke of still-burning fires. Through his rifle scope, Ojasun watched a patrol of Carvex soldiers march a group of captured Zelari down what used to be a main boulevard. The aliens moved slowly, their natural bioluminescence, the soft, colorful glow that came from within their translucent bodies, growing dimmer with each step. When Zelari were happy and healthy, they sparkled like living jewels. These survivors looked like dying candles, their light fading as hopelessness consumed them. The Carvex guards treated their prisoners like livestock being herded to slaughter. They prodded the slower Zellerie with electric shock weapons, kicked anyone who stumbled, and laughed when the gentle beings cried out in pain. Ojasun had seen enough cruelty in his years as a soldier to know that these weren't warriors following orders. These were bullies enjoying the suffering of helpless victims. "Ghost Leader, this is Ghost 3, whispered Corporal Yundabin. Through the team's encrypted communication system. Her voice was so quiet that even Ojasun, only 20 meters away, could barely hear her through his earpiece. "I count 17 hostiles escorting approximately 40 civilians. Mixed armor types, standard infantry protection with a few heavy assault suits. They're following a standard patrol pattern. No variation, no awareness of potential threats." Jae-sung studied the enemy patrol through his scope and shook his head in amazement. He had spent 15 years fighting guerrilla wars in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. He had hunted terrorists through the frozen wasteland of Antarctica, tracked insurgents across the burning deserts of Africa, and fought enemy soldiers in jungles so thick with poisonous plants that just breathing without a filter could kill you in minutes. During all those years, he had learned to recognize the difference between experienced soldiers and overconfident amateurs, real warriors. Moved carefully through enemy territory, constantly checking for threats, varying their routes, staying alert to danger. These Carvex soldiers moved like tourists on a sightseeing trip, completely confident that nothing in this ruined city could possibly hurt them. They were about to learn how wrong they were. "All ghost units, this is Ghost Leader," Ojasun whispered into his communicator. "Hunter-killer protocol is now active. Remember, we want complete silence. No survivors to report our presence, no evidence of how they died. Execute on my mark." Around the ruined city, 20 human soldiers began to move from hiding places that should have been impossible to use. Private Kim Min-ho had spent the last 6 hours buried under a pile of rubble that would have crushed any normal person, breathing through a small air tube and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Corporal Lee Soo-jin had been hiding underwater in a toxic pool of chemical runoff from the destroyed factories, using specialized breathing equipment that let her survive in liquid that would have dissolved the skin off most alien species. Sergeant Park Hae-won had positioned herself inside the twisted remains of a collapsed crystal tower, hanging from support beams that wouldn't have held the weight of any species other than humans. The structure creaked and swayed with every movement, ready to fall completely at any moment. But she had learned to move so carefully that even the unstable ruins couldn't detect her presence. These were hiding places that only creatures from a death world would even consider using. Most galactic species would have died just from trying to breathe in some of these locations. The humans not only survived in them, they had turned them into perfect ambush positions.
"Execute,"
commanded. The Carvex patrol died in absolute silence. Human soldiers emerged from impossible positions like deadly ghosts, striking with knives and bare hands before disappearing back into the ruins. The entire attack lasted less than 30 seconds, and when it was over, 17 enemy soldiers lay dead without having had time to fire a single shot or send a warning to their commanders. "Rescue team, move in immediately," Ojasun ordered. The freed Zalari stared in complete amazement as the human soldiers appeared around them. These weren't the crude, primitive beings they had heard about in galactic news reports. These were predators who moved through the destroyed city like they had been born in places like this, completely comfortable in an environment that was trying to kill them with every step. Private Choi the Jin took point as the team began leading the civilians toward the safe zone. She guided them through passages between collapsed buildings that were too narrow for the bulky Karvek soldiers to follow, across pools of toxic waste that would have killed most species, and through gaps in the rubble that required the precise balance and strength that only humans possessed. One of the Zalari, an elderly being whose natural light was slowly returning as hope replaced despair, moved up beside her with obvious difficulty. His crystalline body was cracked from the bombing, and several of his limbs had been damaged by Karvek's brutality, but his voice carried the musical quality that made Zellari's speech so beautiful to hear. "Human warrior," he said quietly. "How do your people survive in such terrible places? This ruined city would kill most species just from the poisoned air and unstable structures. Yet you move through it as if it holds no danger for you." Private Choi the Gin looked back at the destruction around them, the twisted metal, the pools of toxic chemicals, the unstable ruins that could collapse at any moment, and smiled with the confidence of someone who had grown up on a planet where all of this would be considered a relatively safe environment. "Elder," she replied, helping him navigate around a particularly dangerous section of broken crystal. "We're from Earth. Compared to home, this is actually a pretty nice vacation spot." Morning sun was just beginning to rise over the ruins of Sector 7 when the world changed forever. Corporal Lim So-young knelt beside a wounded Zalari child, her medic bag open beside her as she worked to stop the bleeding from a piece of shrapnel that had torn through the young being's crystalline arm. The little Zalari was crying, not making sound like human children, but flashing rapid patterns of dim light that showed pain and fear. "It's okay, little one," So-young whispered gently, using the basic Zellari phrases she had learned. "The bad people can't hurt you anymore. You're safe now." She had been working as a combat medic for 8 years, but this was the first time she had treated alien civilians. The Zellari were so different from humans. Their bodies were partially transparent, filled with a soft, colorful light that changed based on their emotions. When they were healthy and happy, they glowed like living jewels. When they were hurt and scared like this child, their light became dim and flickering, like a candle about to go out. So-young had already saved dozens of Zellari survivors over the past 3 days. She was known throughout her unit as someone who never gave up on a patient, no matter how badly wounded they were. Her fellow soldiers joked that she could bring people back from the dead through sheer stubbornness and medical skill. The Karvek's sniper had been watching the human rescue operations for hours, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He was hidden in the ruins of what used to be a crystal tower, nearly 2 kilometers away from the human medical station. Through his advanced scope, he could see the female human medic working to save alien civilians, the kind of weakness that his people despised above all else. "Pathetic Deathworld animals," he muttered to himself as he lined up the shot, caring about inferior species. Time to teach them about real strength. The plasma bolt traveled faster than sound, crossing the distance between the sniper's position and the medical station in less than 2 seconds. Lim So-young never saw it coming. One moment she was bandaging the Zalari child's wound, smiling as the little being's natural light grew a bit brighter with hope. The next moment, there was a flash of superheated energy, and she was gone. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then something changed in the human forces that no alien species had ever witnessed before. Captain On Sung-ho was positioned on a hilltop 500 meters away, watching the rescue operations. Through military binoculars, he saw So-young die, saw her body fall beside the Zellari child she had been trying to save, saw her medical supplies scatter across the ground that was now stained with both human and alien blood. What he saw next made him understand why every predator on Earth learned to fear humanity above all other threats. His Marines didn't retreat. They didn't take cover. They didn't follow standard military protocol for dealing with sniper attacks. Instead, they transformed into something that had evolved over millions of years of surviving on a planet where everything was trying to kill. Then the change was immediate and terrifying to witness. These soldiers who had been following careful, disciplined tactics just moments before suddenly became something primal and dangerous. Their movements became faster, more aggressive. Voices over the radio changed from professional military communication to something that sounded more like hunting calls. "All units, this is Bravo Leader," Unsumho said into his communicator, his own voice now carrying an edge that made even his own troops shiver. "Weapons are now free. No prisoners. No mercy. Hunt them all down." The response came back from 20 different human units scattered across the sector. Every voice carried the same deadly promise. "Copy that, sir. Time to go to work." What happened next defied every principle of military science that galactic civilizations had developed. Over thousands of years of warfare, when most species suffered casualties, their fighting effectiveness decreased. Their soldiers became more cautious, more afraid, more likely to make mistakes or retreat to safety. Humans were different. When they lost one of their own, especially someone they cared about, they became exponentially more dangerous. It was like watching a switch flip in their brains, transforming them from civilized soldiers into the apex predators that had once hunted mammoth and saber-toothed tigers with nothing but stone weapons and raw determination. Major Ru Hyanwu was commanding a battalion of 200 Marines who had been following standard urban warfare protocols just minutes earlier. Now he led them in a coordinated assault that ignored every rule of military tactics. They charged directly through kill zones that should have been impassable, absorbed casualties that should have broken their morale, and kept fighting with wounds that should have sent them to medical stations. The Carvex defenders had never seen anything like it. They had fought dozens of different alien species over the centuries, and they all followed predictable patterns. When you hurt them, they became afraid. When you killed their friends, they became demoralized.
Ow.
When you showed them superior firepower, they retreated or surrendered. These humans didn't follow any of those patterns. Instead, they seemed to become stronger and more dangerous with every loss they suffered. They used tactics that no civilized species would consider, ramming their vehicles into enemy positions, using their own bodies as weapons, fighting hand-to-hand in situations where any sane soldier would use ranged weapons. A Carvex commander named Vextar found himself trapped in a bunker as human soldiers tore through his defenses like they were made of paper. He had commanded successful campaigns against 17 different species, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for enemies who seemed to get more deadly when you hurt them. "What are these things?" he screamed into his communicator. As explosions shook the walls around him, "They're not acting like soldiers anymore. They're like wild animals." The bunker door exploded inward, and Sergeant Kang Min-ji stepped through the smoking hole. She had been one of Lim So-young's closest friends, and her face now carried an expression of cold rage that made the Carvex commander's blood freeze in his veins. Vextar tried to surrender, tried to explain that he was just following orders, tried to beg for mercy. But as his strength faded and darkness closed in around him, he managed to ask one final question. "What manner of creatures are you?" Sergeant Kang Min-ji looked down at the dying alien with eyes that held no compassion, no mercy, and no forgiveness. "We're the monsters that evolved on a world full of bigger monsters," she replied, "and you just killed our friend." 6 hours later, Sector 7 was completely under human control. Every Carvex soldier, every occupation force member, every collaborator was dead. The humans had suffered additional casualties during their assault, but each loss had only made them more determined, more ruthless, more efficient at killing their enemies. The Zalari child that Lim So-young had died trying to save was found safe in a human medical station, his wounds properly treated and his natural light glowing bright with health. The humans had made sure of that first, before beginning their hunt for revenge. In the ruins of the Crystal City, the Zelari survivors whispered to each other about the strange aliens who had come to save them. They spoke of warriors who became more dangerous when hurt, soldiers who fought like the legendary heroes from their oldest stories, protectors who would sacrifice anything to keep the innocent safe. The humans called it the pack mentality. The Zelari called it something else. Hope. General Vexther stood in the center of the most secure laboratory in the Carvex Empire, surrounded by gleaming metal walls and the soft hum of advanced biological equipment. This underground facility on the Imperial capital world had been built specifically to house the Empire's most terrible secret. A weapon so devastating that even the Carvex military leadership had been reluctant to use it until now. The weapon itself didn't look particularly impressive. It was contained in a simple, crystalline cylinder about the size of a human fist, filled with what appeared to be ordinary water. But that innocent-looking liquid contained billions of engineered organisms designed to destroy any living creature that breathed them in. This bioweapon had been tested on dozens of different species over the past 50 years, and it had never failed to kill everything it touched. "Sir, all deployment systems are ready," reported his chief scientist, a thin, Carvex female who had spent her entire career developing ways to kill entire populations without damaging valuable infrastructure. "The atmospheric dispersal satellites are in position above 3 human-occupied worlds. We can begin simultaneous deployment on your command." Vexther looked around at his assembled staff, generals, scientists, and intelligence officers who represented the best minds in the Carvex Empire. They had all agreed that this was the only way to end the humiliating defeats they had been suffering at the hands of primitive, Deathworld savages. The humans had been winning battles that should have been impossible for them to survive. They used tactics that no civilized species would consider, fought with an intensity that defied military science, and refused to surrender even when facing overwhelming odds. Worst of all, they seemed to become more dangerous every time the Carvex hurt them, like some kind of infection that grew stronger when attacked. "Gentlemen," Vexther announced, with the solemnity of someone about to make history, "today we end this war with the weapon that has never failed us. The Terran immune systems will collapse within hours of exposure. Their primitive biology cannot possibly resist a plague engineered specifically to target mammalian respiratory systems." He activated the deployment sequence with a flourish, pressing his palm against a scanner that confirmed his identity and authorization. Across the galaxy, 3 different worlds where human forces were stationed received invisible gifts from orbit, clouds of engineered death that would soon turn every living creature on those planets into rotting corpses. Their bodies will serve as a warning to any other species considering resistance to Imperial expansion, Vexther continued, already imagining the reports of total human casualties that would begin arriving within hours. "Let the galaxy see. What happens when primitive animals dare to challenge the Carvex Empire?" For the first 6 hours, everything went according to plan. Satellites reported successful deployment of the bioweapon across all target worlds. Atmospheric sensors confirmed that the engineered plague had spread throughout the human-occupied territories. Intelligence operatives on nearby worlds prepared to document the mass graves that would soon be needed to dispose of human corpses. Then the reports started coming in. They made no sense at all. "Sir," his intelligence officer stammered, staring at his data screens with confusion and growing fear. "The TERRANS ... They're not dying. In fact, they're not even getting sick. Our surveillance shows them continuing normal military operations as if nothing has happened." Vexther felt his confidence crack like ice under pressure. "That's impossible. Check your instruments. The plague must not have deployed properly." "Sir, deployment was confirmed successful. The bioweapon is present in the atmosphere at lethal concentrations, but the humans appear to be completely unaffected." On the distant world of Zalari Secundus, Colonel Beek Jihoon stood on the balcony of what used to be the planetary governor's mansion, breathing the contaminated air without even basic protective equipment. Around him, his soldiers continued their patrol operations as if the invisible plague swirling through the atmosphere was nothing more than a gentle breeze. The Korean officer had grown up in Seoul during one of Earth's periodic disease outbreaks, when a mutated flu virus had killed millions of people worldwide. He had watched his own immune system adapt and overcome infections that would have been fatal to most galactic species. Like all humans, he carried within his DNA the genetic legacy of survivors who had endured countless plagues, famines, ice ages, and extinction events. "Biological analysis complete, sir," reported Lieutenant Han Yuri, looking up from her portable laboratory equipment. "Standard plague vector RNA, base designed to attack respiratory systems. Interesting engineering, but nothing we haven't seen variations of back home." Baek Ji-hoon nodded thoughtfully. During humanity's violent evolutionary history, their ancestors had survived diseases that made this Carvex bioweapon look like a minor cold. The Black Death, Spanish flu, and dozens of other pandemics had killed hundreds of millions of humans. But they had also created evolutionary pressure that forged immune systems capable of adapting to almost any biological threat. "Can we weaponize it?" he asked, with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. "Already working on deployment methods, sir. We should be able to reverse engineer their delivery systems and improve the biological effectiveness. Give me 48 hours. Within 2 days, Carvex worlds throughout the Empire began receiving unexpected packages from space. The same satellites that had delivered death to human worlds now carried refined versions of their own bioweapons back to their creators. But these new plagues had been modified by a species that understood biological warfare from the perspective of survivors rather than aggressors. The humans didn't just deploy the original Carvex plague, they improved it. They made it more contagious, more resistant to treatment, and specifically adapted to target Carvex biology. Worlds that had never known disease suddenly found themselves facing epidemics that their medical systems couldn't understand or treat. General Vexler watched his empire begin to crumble as reports flooded in from dozens of infected worlds. Military bases fell silent as their entire populations succumbed to plagues that had been designed by their own scientists. Industrial worlds stopped producing weapons and supplies as their workers died by the millions. How is this possible? He whispered to his dying staff, many of whom were already showing symptoms of the enhanced bioweapons. How can primitive savages turn our own greatest weapon against us? The answer came from intercepts of human military communications, transmitted in clear language as if the humans wanted their enemies to understand exactly what was happening to them. "This is Colonel Baek Ji-hoon to all Carvex forces," the transmission said with cold satisfaction. "You made a fundamental mistake about Deathworld species. We don't just survive extinction events, we use them as evolutionary training. Every plague that has ever tried to kill us has made us stronger." Now you get to experience what biological disloyal warfare looks like when it's designed by the species that survived every pandemic our planet could throw at us. The Carvex Empire had spent centuries using bioweapons to exterminate peaceful civilizations. Now they discovered what happened when those weapons were turned against them by creatures who had learned to treat plague as just another environmental hazard to overcome and win. In the ruins of his laboratory, surrounded by the corpses of his staff, General Vexler finally understood the terrible truth. Deathworlders didn't just survive extinction events. They learned from them, adapted to them, eventually mastered them. The hunters had become the hunted. And the plague they had unleashed was coming home. The Great Retreat had become something much worse than a military withdrawal. It was a complete collapse of everything the Carvex Empire had built over 3 centuries of conquest. Admiral Won Jae-hyun stood on the command bridge of the battleship Busan, watching through the massive viewing windows as enemy ships fled in every direction. It's like insects scattering when someone lifts a rock. These weren't the same arrogant Carvex. Fleets that had arrived in Zalari space just months ago, confident in their superiority and eager to destroy another peaceful civilization. Now they ran with the desperate panic of predators who had suddenly realized they were facing something much more dangerous than themselves. He paused to let the full impact of these terms sink in before continuing. "You will pay reparations to every species your empire has attacked, enslaved, or destroyed. The payments will continue for the next 200 years and will be calculated based on the actual damage inflicted, not your ability to pay." The Emperor's face appeared on the communication screen, showing the full extent of his defeat. This being, who had once commanded the fear and respect of half the galaxy, now looked like a tired old man who had lost everything that had ever given his life meaning. And finally, Admiral Kim Dong-han continued with surgical precision, permanent. Human monitoring stations will be established in every Carvex system. These stations will observe all activities and ensure compliance with the surrender terms. Any attempt to rebuild military capabilities, any act of aggression against other species, any violation of the peace agreement will result in the complete extinction of your species. The silence that followed lasted for nearly a minute.
Hello.
The Emperor finally spoke again. His voice was barely above a whisper. And if we refuse these terms? Admiral Kim Dong-han's response was delivered without emotion, like someone reading a weather report. Look at your orbital defense platforms. The Emperor's personal screens immediately switched to show the space around his homeworld. Where? Massive defensive installations had once protected the heart of the Carvex Empire. Now, there was only twisted metal and empty space. Human engineering teams had spent the past week systematically dismantling defenses that had taken centuries to build, leaving the most protected world in the Empire completely vulnerable to attack. Those platforms had protected this world for over 800 years. The Emperor said, his voice filled with disbelief. How did you destroy them so quickly? We didn't destroy them, Admiral Kim Dong-han replied with the patience of someone explaining something obvious to a child. We took them apart piece by piece and studied how they worked. Your technology is now part of our databases. Your secrets are now our weapons. Your defenses are now our blueprints for better defenses. He let this information settle before delivering the final ultimatum. You have 12 hours to ratify the surrender terms and begin implementation. After that time expires, we will implement a more permanent solution to the problem your empire represents. The meaning was clear without being explicitly stated. The humans had demonstrated that they could dismantle the Carvex Empire piece by piece, taking it apart like a machine and studying every component. If the Carvex chose to continue fighting, the humans would simply finish the job they had started. The surrender documents were transmitted to the human fleet in 8 hours, signed by every major leader in the Carvex government and ratified by their highest military commanders. The empire that had terrorized the galaxy for 3 centuries officially ceased to exist as a military threat. Lieutenant Noha Young watched the signing ceremony from the communications center, feeling strangely empty despite witnessing what should have been a moment of triumph. She had joined the military to protect innocent people, but the systematic destruction of an entire empire felt different from the clean victories she had imagined. Is this what victory looks like, Commander? She asked the senior officer beside her. Commander Park the-yoon looked out at the defeated Carvex homeworld and nodded with the grim satisfaction of someone who understood the true cost of peace. This is what happens when you make Deathworlders care about protecting innocent people, Lieutenant. We don't just win wars against bullies and genocidal empires, we end them permanently. The age of Carvex expansion was over. The galaxy would remember what happened when peaceful species cried for help, and the monsters from Earth answered that call. 6 months had passed since the last Carvex world officially surrendered, and the galaxy was still adjusting to a reality that no one could have predicted. Ambassador Kethalon stood in the rebuilt council chamber on New Zelion Prime, looking out at a room filled with representatives from dozens of different species who had gathered to witness something unprecedented in galactic history. The chamber itself was a perfect example of how the universe had changed. The original crystal structure had been grown by Zellery artists over the course of centuries, shaped with care and patience into something that was both functional and beautiful. When the Carvex bombardment had shattered it into rubble, everyone had assumed that such delicate artistry could never be restored. But human engineers had studied the wreckage with the same methodical attention they brought to everything else. Learning to understand how Zellery crystal growing techniques worked, then they had combined their own structural knowledge with alien artistry to create something even more magnificent than the original. The new council chamber was stronger, more beautiful, and designed to survive attacks that would have destroyed any conventional building. It was a symbol of what cooperation between species could accomplish, when no one had to worry about aggressive empires destroying everything they built. Representatives of the Galactic Council, Kethalon announced, his voice carrying clearly through the crystalline acoustics of the chamber. "I am here to formally announce the establishment of the Terran Protectorate. Now 27 star systems have officially requested and been granted protection by human forces." The murmur that rippled through the assembled delegates was a mixture of relief, curiosity, and barely concealed nervousness. Everyone present had read the reports of what the humans had done to the Carvex Empire. The systematic dismantling of a 300-year-old military superpower had been impressive and terrifying in equal measure. "The terms of the Protectorate are simple," Kethlin continued, reading from the document that had been negotiated. "Between human leaders and the species requesting protection, protected worlds agree to resolve disputes through peaceful negotiation and to provide mutual aid in times of crisis. In return, any act of aggression against a Protectorate member will be considered an act of aggression against Earth itself." The change in galactic politics was immediate and more profound than anyone had expected. Species that had been quietly building up their military forces for expansion campaigns suddenly found themselves announcing new cultural exchange programs instead. Trade disputes that might have escalated into small wars were now settled through careful negotiation, because no one wanted to risk the possibility that their actions might attract human attention. He paused to let the full impact of these terms sink in before continuing. "You will pay reparations to every species your empire has attacked, enslaved, or destroyed. The payments will continue for the next 200 years and will be calculated based on the actual damage inflicted, not your ability to pay." The Emperor's face appeared on the communication screen, showing the full extent of his defeat. This being, who had once commanded the fear and respect of half the galaxy, now looked like a tired old man who had lost everything that had ever given his life meaning. And finally, Admiral Kim Dong-han continued with surgical precision, "Permanent. Human monitoring stations will be established in every Carvex system. These stations will observe all activities and ensure compliance with the surrender terms. Any attempt to rebuild military capabilities, any act of aggression against other species, any violation of the peace agreement will result in the complete extinction of your species." The silence that followed lasted for nearly a minute.
Hello.
The Emperor finally spoke again. His voice was barely above a whisper. "And if we refuse these terms?" Admiral Kim Dong-han's response was delivered without emotion, like someone reading a weather report. "Look at your orbital defense platforms." The Emperor's personal screens immediately switched to show the space around his homeworld, where massive defensive installations had once protected the heart of the Carvex Empire. Now, there was only twisted metal and empty space. Human engineering teams had spent the past week systematically dismantling defenses that had taken centuries to build, leaving the most protected world in the Empire completely vulnerable to attack. Those platforms had protected this world for over 800 years. The Emperor said, his voice filled with disbelief. "How did you destroy them so quickly?" "We didn't destroy them," Admiral Kim Dong-han replied with the patience of someone explaining something obvious to a child. "We took them apart piece by piece and studied how they worked. Your technology is now part of our databases. Your secrets are now our weapons. Your defenses are now our blueprints for better defenses." He let this information settle before delivering the final ultimatum. "You have 12 hours to ratify the surrender terms and begin implementation. After that time expires, we will implement a more permanent solution to the problem your empire represents." The meaning was clear without being explicitly stated. The humans had demonstrated that they could dismantle the Carvex Empire piece by piece, taking it apart like a machine and studying every component. If the Carvex chose to continue fighting, the humans would simply finish the job they had started. The surrender documents were transmitted to the human fleet in 8 hours, signed by every major leader in the Carvex government and ratified by their highest military commanders. The empire that had terrorized the galaxy for 3 centuries officially ceased to exist as a military threat. Lieutenant Noha Young watched the signing ceremony from the communications center, feeling strangely empty despite witnessing what should have been a moment of triumph. She had joined the military to protect innocent people, but the systematic destruction of an entire empire felt different from the clean victories she had imagined. "Is this what victory looks like, Commander?" she asked the senior officer beside her. Commander Park the Yoon looked out at the defeated Karvek's homeworld and nodded with the grim satisfaction of someone who understood the true cost of peace. "This is what happens when you make Deathworlders care about protecting innocent people, Lieutenant. We don't just win wars against bullies and genocidal empires, we end them permanently." The age of Karvek's expansion was over. The galaxy would remember what happened when peaceful species cried for help, and the monsters from Earth answered that call. 6 months had passed since the last Karvek's world officially surrendered, and the galaxy was still adjusting to a reality that no one could have predicted. Ambassador Kethalon stood in the rebuilt council chamber on New Zelion Prime, looking out at a room filled with representatives from dozens of different species who had gathered to witness something unprecedented in galactic history. The chamber itself was a perfect example of how the universe had changed. The original crystal structure had been grown by Zellery artists over the course of centuries, shaped with care and patience into something that was both functional and beautiful. When the Karvek's bombardment had shattered it into rubble, everyone had assumed that such delicate artistry could never be restored. But human engineers had studied the wreckage with the same methodical attention they brought to everything else. Learning to understand how Zellery crystal growing techniques worked, then they had combined their own structural knowledge with alien artistry to create something even more magnificent than the original. The new council chamber was stronger, more beautiful, and designed to survive attacks that would have destroyed any conventional building. It was a symbol of what cooperation between species could accomplish, when no one had to worry about aggressive empires destroying everything they built. "Representatives of the Galactic Council," Kethalon announced, his voice carrying clearly through the crystalline acoustics of the chamber. "I am here to formally announce the establishment of the Terran Protectorate. Now 27 star systems have officially requested and been granted protection by human forces." The murmur that rippled through the assembled delegates was a mixture of relief, curiosity, and barely concealed nervousness. Everyone present had read the reports of what the humans had done to the Karvek's empire. The systematic dismantling of a 300-year-old military superpower had been impressive and terrifying in equal measure. "The terms of the Protectorate are simple," Kethalon continued, reading from the document that had been negotiated. "Between human leaders and the species requesting protection, protected worlds agree to resolve disputes through peaceful negotiation and to provide mutual aid in times of crisis. In return, any act of aggression against a Protectorate member will be considered an act of aggression against Earth itself." The change in galactic politics was immediate and more profound than anyone had expected. Species that had been quietly building up their military forces for expansion campaigns suddenly found themselves announcing new cultural exchange programs instead. Trade disputes that might have escalated into small wars were now settled through careful negotiation, because no one wanted to risk the possibility that their actions might attract human attention. The mere mention that the humans were monitoring the situation was enough to end most conflicts before they could begin. The Deathworlders had established a reputation for being very good at solving problems permanently, and most species preferred to handle their own disputes rather than have solutions imposed on them by creatures who had turned the galaxy's most feared empire into a collection of helpless agricultural worlds. Admiral Kim Sung-ho stood on the observation deck of Guardian Station, one of 43 human monitoring posts that had been established throughout former Karvek's territory. The station was built like a fortress, designed to serve as both an early warning system and a base of operations for human forces in this sector of space. Through the transparent aluminum windows, he could see the daily miracle of reconstruction taking place. Human and alien engineering teams worked side by side, repairing damage that had been inflicted over years of warfare. Zellery crystal growers collaborated with human architects to rebuild cities that were even more beautiful than they had been before the war. Karvek civilians worked alongside their former victims, learning to grow food instead of building weapons. It was exactly the kind of scene that the Admiral had hoped to see when he first joined the fleet. Different species working together to build something better than what any of them could have created alone. But he also knew that peace was only maintained by the constant vigilance of those willing to fight to protect it. "Admiral," his aide reported, Walking up with a datapad full of the morning's intelligence reports, we're receiving distress calls. From 3 different sectors, the Vorthok hegemony appears to be testing the boundaries of the new galactic order. Their fleets are massing near the borders of 2 protectorate worlds, and they've been making threatening demands about tribute payments. Kim Sung-ho looked at the reports and felt the familiar mixture of disappointment and grim satisfaction that came with realizing that some species never learned from the examples of others. The Vorthok were another militaristic empire that had built their civilization on conquering weaker neighbors. And apparently they thought that the destruction of the Karvex had created new opportunities for expansion. Any indication that they're aware of our protection agreements with those worlds? He asked. Yes, sir. We intercepted communications showing that they know exactly what they're doing. They seem to think that humans are too far away to respond quickly, and that we won't risk a major war over a few minor species. The Admiral smiled with the quiet contentment of a wolf that had just spotted prey wandering too close to the den where his pack kept their young. The Vorthok were about to learn the same lesson that the Karvex had learned, but hopefully with less destruction and loss of life. Signal the fleet, he said calmly. It's like someone else needs to learn about Deathworld justice. Send a message to the Vorthok leadership. They have 24 hours to withdraw their forces and issue formal apologies to the threatened worlds. After that, we start teaching them why picking on our friends is a very bad idea. Within hours, human ships throughout the galaxy began moving toward the sound of distress calls. Just as they had 6 months ago when the Zellery first cried for help, the response was swift, organized, carried out with the methodical efficiency that had become the signature of human military operations. But this time, the galaxy was watching and learning. The message was clear and simple when peaceful. Species called for help. The children of Earth would always answer. And their answer was always the same. Those who preyed on the innocent would face creatures who had learned to become perfect monsters in service of protecting everything they loved. The age of easy conquest was over. The Deathworlders were watching, and they never forgot their friends or forgave their enemies.